Hello and welcome to the recorded study guide for the second QA. This QA covers Units 4 and 5. We're going over the American Revolution and then the creation of our new government, which in turn creates the Constitution. There's a lot of stuff to cover. There's going to be a lot of information that you need to kind of focus on for your test. So you need to take good notes during this, and if you do, you'll be fine. So we'll start with, like we always do, with the first thing on your study guide, which is the Second Continental Congress. I don't know, I think that this is not here on your study guide. Congress, for some reason, did not get copied onto there, but that's alright, doesn't matter, you get the idea. You can write it in. It is on page 178, the stuff that we'll be looking at. Basically, what you need to understand is that, things are getting pretty bad with Britain, and the American leaders decide that they need to sit down together and take action. So, out of this Continental Congress, they basically do two things. One is that they do create the Declaration of Independence, which is on 181. We know a lot about that. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. That's him right there. Maybe even writing it. Oh, man. Or maybe not. Maybe just writing something else. Who knows? The other thing that the Second Continental Congress does is that we will look at here in just a little bit, but they create the Continental Army. So Second Continental Congress creates the Continental Army. They also create the Declaration of Independence. So with this meeting, it kind of kicks off the Revolutionary War, and people have to choose sides. You basically have three choices here. If you're an American at this time or you're living in the American colonies, you're basically going loyalist, patriot, or neutral. All of these are kind of outlined and talked about on page 195 through 196. It gives you percentages, the breakdown of the total population, who was what, and all that kind of stuff. But what you need to kind of look at is, we're talking the majority of people are going to be in this area right here, patriot or neutral, because if you look at a pie chart, we're talking like this would be neutral, this would be patriot, and this would be loyalist. So there's definitely more up in the top part of this pie chart, and less loyalist. There's just not as much loyalist support. A loyalist, again, remember, they're loyal to the royal family. So loyal, royal, yeah. All right. Patriot, obviously, he's got the American flag right here, so you know that he's supporting breaking away from Britain. And then neutral is just in the middle. They are pacifists, which means that they don't really want to be a part of the war or have anything to do with it. But if you were a patriot, you're supporting the Continental Army that was created by the Second Continental Congress, which we talked about just a second ago. To look at some details about the Continental Army, you're looking at page 197. You need to understand that at first, this group of the American Army was very untrained, very unorganized, mostly just part-time emergency volunteers. The Continental Congress puts this guy down here, George Washington, in charge of it. Also talks a little bit about him on page 197. He's the commander of the Continental Army. That's something that the Continental Congress decides as well. So first, when we look at this, when you look at it on paper, you have a very untrained emergency kind of volunteer force for the Americans. And then on the other side, you have one of the most powerful nations in the world with its army. But even though Britain is very powerful, they still have trouble with their army. They have so little support for the war and for joining up for the war or joining up to fight the Americans, because a lot of people back in Britain just think it's going to be an easy fight, and why are we even really bothering with it? because they're obviously going to beat the Americans really easily. Not a lot of them sign up. So what the British have to do is they have to hire people to be in their army. If you're a professional, like if you're a person that is hired to fight for another country, you're called a mercenary. And these people are from a region, and they are in Germany, and they're known as the Hessians. So Hessian mercenaries are the people that are going to be fighting for the British on their side for pay. And this is on page 198. The British are going to hire these guys. They're going to come over. They're going to fight the Americans because they just don't have any real big support. Because when you look at it on the American side, when you enlisted for the Army, you were there for a year at first, and then it was like over. And that caused them a lot of trouble because they could not ever get anybody trained very well. And then on the other side of it, the British, it was like the reverse. If you signed up for the Army, you were signed up for life, which doesn't really make people too interested in signing up because, who wants to do something like that for life? I mean, you're in the Army for life. That's a long time. So then we actually get into some actual battles. The Americans aren't doing so well. They don't have a lot of supplies. They don't have a lot of money. Things are not going too well until the Battle of Saratoga, which is on page 200 through 201. And this is not a 6, it is a 0. Battle of Saratoga, we call this, if you remember, the turning point of the war. It is a turning point mainly because they are victorious. The Americans are victorious at the Battle of Saratoga, and it is the first major battle that we win. And that is important because this country right here, well, that's a flag, but the flag represents the country of France. That country is waiting for the Americans to win a major battle, and once we win a major battle, they will join us and actually start fighting with us and giving us supplies and being our ally. And because of that brings their ally in, Spain, to then help us as well, because both of these countries hate the British and they want to see them lose because of other things that have happened in the past, like the French and Indian War, Spanish Armada, all that kind of stuff that we've already talked about. But because we win the Battle of Saratoga, it's a turning point, brings these two countries into the war on our side, and the shift in momentum is pretty significant. We get a big boost from this. So the effects are not instantaneous. We still struggle through a little bit of the war. Valley Forge is a big event in American history. You can find that on page 207. So George Washington retreats from Philadelphia, sets up winter camp at Valley Forge, because at this time you're basically hanging out for the winter because you can't really go and fight in the snow and you can't really march and stuff. So you basically set up winter camp and kind of wait out the winter. Well, the Americans do not have very many supplies. They don't have blankets or food or warm clothing or new shoes or anything. So they, like I've already talked about in previous study guides, they get frostbite on their feet. They have to cut off their feet because of the frostbite and get amputations. And you're in 1777. You are in the middle of a forest and it is cold and you just got your feet chopped off. I doubt it's the most sterile conditions. Probably going to get a nice infection and you're going to die. So it's a terrible situation. It's a horrible hardship that they have to go through. And when you look at the overall numbers in Valley Forge, nearly 25% or a quarter of the total troops at Valley Forge die over the winter. And that means that out of 4 soldiers, by the end of the winter, one of those guys was going to die. And it wasn't because of battles or anything like that. It was because of malnutrition, exposure, disease, and like I said, those infections from amputation. So a lot of bad stuff happened at Valley Forge, but one good thing that came of Valley Forge is we got to train under foreign army officers like Baron von Steuben. You can see this picture right here representing training, I guess. or something. So, yeah, that's good. They came out of the winter, and yeah, okay, a lot of people died, and people don't have feet anymore, but some people don't have feet. It's not like they all didn't have feet. That would be ridiculous. I don't think they would have won if nobody had feet. Anyway, Baron von Steuben trains them up, gets out of the winter. They're a much more experienced fighting force, and they have a much better chance at winning the actual war. Another thing that helps the Americans over the course of the Revolutionary War is this guy, George Rogers Clark. This can be found on page 209. 209, okay. George Rogers Clark, he wants to go out, and he takes a little fighting force down the Ohio River and goes and attacks a fort in Kaskaskia. And what we have talked about before is with George Rogers Clark and other aspects of the war, we are spreading the British troops out too thin. If you remember, I've talked about in the past thinking about it like if you've ever made homemade pizza and you've got your pizza dough in the middle of the pan, and so like you try to spread it out to all the corners of like the cookie sheet, but if the dough is too small or there's not enough of it or the pan is too big, what you get is as you are trying to stretch it out, there's thin spots in the dough. It's weak points, and it'll rip there, and that's where, obviously that's going to ruin your pizza. Well, in this case, the pizza dough is actually the British soldiers, and the cookie sheet is kind of like the whole war, and the British have to be, or the dough, has to be pushed out over the whole entire span of the cookie sheet or war, out to fight George Rogers Clark all the way out in the frontier, and then to fight the French, and then to fight the Spanish all the way in other corners of the cookie sheet or war, or whatever. But something that's probably not been combined before, cookie sheets and war. So they have these aspects of pushing it out, spreading the troops out way too thin for the British, and it causes them basically to falter because they don't have enough support, and because George Rogers Clark is spreading them out into the frontier, it weakens them even more. Another place that fighting takes place is, of course, on the ocean. The Americans do not have a very big navy, and they had to actually hire what are called privateers. Let's go back to blue. They had to hire privateers to basically capture British ships and attack them on the open sea. The privateers are basically pirates that are granted permission to attack an enemy's merchant ships, so then we steal their supplies, and because we steal their supplies, we gain those supplies and they don't get them, so win-win for us. So privateers, we get them to help us capture British merchant ships. One of the most famous privateers that is part of this war effort is John Paul Jones. He's on page 210 through 211. So, here are privateers, if you're wondering. But yeah, John Paul Jones, father of the American Navy, privateer. He goes over to England, has a big attack and stuff, and yeah, all right. So, the British are kind of on the downslide right now because they are they're very spread out. They do not have a lot of support, and they're trying to look for a new way to kind of go about winning this war. So what they do is they shift the war to the south, and there are a few. So basically, when you're looking at this one on your study guide, you need to kind of think about asking yourself, why did they do this? And because they did this for a few reasons. They thought that there would be more loyalists, and they thought that slaves would help them in fighting. So they thought that they would get more support in general, and they thought that they would get more support from loyalists because they thought there would be more loyalists in the South, and then they thought that slaves, if they told them that we will give African Americans their freedom if they fight on our side. So a lot of African Americans did join for that promise of freedom, but not nearly as many as the British had hoped for, and there weren't as many loyalists down in the South either. But so the Southern strategy falls apart rather quickly, mainly because Nathaniel Greene, who is in charge of the American Southern Army later on, does a very good job of kind of getting his troops in order, and he's a very good strategist, and he kind of just does a lot of good things in terms of planning. So on the other side of that, the British have a really hard time with setting up their strategy in the South because they thought there would be more support, and there isn't. Lord Cornwallis, who is the leader of the British forces at the end of the war, he is on page 214. So Lord Cornwallis is the leader of the British forces. He has seen that basically the Southern strategy has failed. There is not as much support as they once had hoped, and they have to retreat, and he retreats back to the coast in hopes that they would be able to gain more supplies from their fleets, from their navy coming in. But what he does is he sets up in the city of Yorktown, which is on page 216, this Battle of Yorktown. This proves to be his big fatal mistake, his big mess up, because what he does, and I've drawn this picture a lot, is that Yorktown's like right here on this peninsula. So, but then also what you have is you have around it, you kind of have like a harbor. So really the only way in or out is like right here. Right through there. So the problem for old Lord Cornwallis is that we've got the Americans coming in from the top here. We've got the Americans coming in from this direction, and then you have French ships blocking off, remember, because French are our allies because of the Battle of Saratoga. You have our French ships blocking off, having a blockade right here. So if we look in this picture right over here, you basically see my drawing, but not nearly as cool on this map because it's like all detailed and stuff, which I don't know. I think mine's pretty nice. Anyway, but basically the British are trapped, and Lord Cornwallis has to surrender, which is what this picture over here represents. And the Americans, this is the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, and the Americans have basically won. So when we look at why the Americans won, we've covered this quite a bit. On page 218, there's this chart right here. Just go look at it. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the Americans were awesome and the British sucked and all that kind of stuff. So we win the war. To end any war, you have to sign like a treaty, and the peace treaty that ends this war is the Treaty of Paris. This is on page 224. The big thing with the Treaty of Paris is how it outlines the boundaries after the war. So before the war, all this yellow was British. After the war, the yellow is British. We are now set up as this pink area, and then the purple is Spanish territory. So what we have is that to the north, this is going to be my awesome drawing of the United States. Oh yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so to the north you have Canada. To the south you have Florida, which is controlled by Spain, and then up the middle you have a natural boundary of the Mississippi River to the west. So you have Mississippi River to the west, Canada to the north. So this is the United States, this is Spain, this is up here is British Canada. So this is a new nation now, down here in the United States with our boundaries and everything like that. We now get out of the war. We are a new nation. But the problem is we're in debt. And we are about $27 million in debt, which is a lot of money. And it's about $730 million in today's money. And we just don't have any money to pay anybody. Don't have any money to pay the soldiers. Don't have any money to pay off our debt to other countries. So what the what the American government at first tries to do is sell or pay off soldiers with land certificates, which isn't really the best option for these soldiers because these soldiers need to eat and buy clothing and stuff, and you can't really buy clothing with land, and you can't really eat land. You have to have money to get crops growing, and so a lot of these land certificates are just having to be sold just for basic supplies. So now we're going to look at how the new nation of the United States kind of grows into a functioning nation. And with that, we leave Unit 4 and we start up with Unit 5, talking about how we form our new government. The first thing on the Americans' mind is that they do not want to have a government in which there can be any abuse of power by a king or by the central government, and that's their main concern. So they come up with this system of government at first after the Revolutionary War called the Articles of Confederation. And so when you look at the Articles of Confederation, it is created in 1781, and it is our first government, our first plan for a government after the Revolutionary War. This is all outlined on page 235 through 236. One of the things that has to be decided right away is what to do with all this new land that has been gained, and that's a big conflict between the small states and the big states, and the big states have more land and the small states want more land because, the more land you have, the more money you can make, the more people you have, and all this kind of stuff. But what leads the Articles to actually being ratified or approved is that there's a compromise on everybody's part, and all the states give up their claims to the western lands, and then it's given to Congress to control, the Confederation Congress, which is like the central government under the Articles of Confederation. So because they give up their claims to the land, everybody's like, okay, we'll approve this Articles of Confederation. It's the very first plan for the government that we have, and if you see the next thing that's on your study guide, weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, that's where we go to next because there are a lot. Mainly the ones that we focus on are that they couldn't, the big ones here, they can't collect taxes and they can't enforce laws. So, first of all, they're not making any money because the government makes money by collecting taxes. And if you can't collect taxes, you can't make money, and you can't support an army or pay soldiers or anything. We'll get into that a little bit later. But they also can't enforce laws. And the way that I talk about this in my class is if you and your parents were set up like the Articles of Confederation, your parents would be the national government. They would be Congress, and you would be like the states. And they would make rules. Congress would make laws that said, your parents would make laws that said, you have a curfew of 11:30, and if you come in at 11:31, you are grounded for 2 weeks. So anytime you're late, you're grounded for 2 weeks. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, if that's how your house was set up, they would say this, and then when you came in at 11:35, it would be up to you, the state, to punish yourself, to enforce the law. So, if you walk in at 11:35, are you going to go, oh, man, I'm late, I guess I'm going to ground myself for 2 weeks? Probably not. And that's what the states did too. If they didn't like a law, they just weren't going to enforce it. And if laws aren't being enforced, it's basically like not having a law at all. Like if there were no cops on the interstate ever, no matter what, no one would follow the speed limit because there's no consequence. No one's saying, hey, you have to follow the speed limit. So that leads to a lot of problems for the government under the Articles of Confederation. They don't have any money to pay their soldiers. A lot of people are in debt, looking for some tax relief, looking for some money just in general. So One of these people is Daniel Shay, and he leads this attack on the national government. He takes over an arsenal, which is where they store weapons, and this is known as Shays Rebellion on page 239. Basically, soldiers and farmers, they're angry about not getting paid and unfair taxation, and they fight. The national government has a horrible time trying to keep this under control. It takes forever, and eventually it's put down, but it opens a lot of people's eyes because they see, if we can't even control a little group of farmers with their pitchforks running around, how are we going to ever be able to stand up if the British come back over and say, hey, we want to take back over this area? Well, they wouldn't be able to, because the national government cannot protect the states, and that's mainly the goal here. We want the national government to protect all of the states, and if they can't, it's basically worthless. So because of Shays Rebellion, it kind of opens people's eyes, and they say, hey, maybe it's time to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. Maybe we sit down and we try something new. And that's where James Madison comes in the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention starts on page 243. James Madison is on 244. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, and that's because he basically organizes this Constitutional Convention where the Constitution is going to be made. It's basically a meeting of all these delegates from all these states, and they come together and they're like, hey, how are we going to fix the government? Well, he introduces his first idea is the Virginia Plan, and that's where we get the idea of having three branches. The legislative, executive, judicial, we'll get into those a little bit later. But what the Virginia Plan says is that, so if we look at the Virginia Plan, we have two houses in the legislative branch, and both of them are going to be based on population. This can all be found on page 245. Now, that means that the bigger the state is, the more votes you get if it's based on population. So, because Virginia is a large state, they would have a lot of votes. Well, Rhode Island or anybody else that's smaller would not have as many votes. So the smaller states don't like this. So what do? They come up with the New Jersey Plan, which is on page 245 and also carries over to page 246. Now, the New Jersey Plan is a little different. They decide that they want to have one house in the legislative branch. This is where the laws are made, where you would send the representatives, and that would be, every state would be equal. So in this, you would get more votes and more representation the bigger your state is. Virginia Plan. New Jersey Plan, everybody's going to be the same. Well, okay, let's talk about the Virginia Plan. If you're a big state, you like this. If you're a small state, you don't, because let's imagine that we have two classrooms that are going to represent states here. In one classroom, you have 20 people, and the vote is going to be on whether or not we should get cheese or pepperoni pizza. All right, and in the room with 20 people in it, they get 3 votes because they have more people. So the more people you have, the more representatives you get to choose. So just like in our example of having representatives go up to the office and vote, that's what we're going to do, except this time the classroom gets 3 because there are more people in it. So we have 3 votes. All 3 of those representatives vote because everybody in the class wants, or the majority of people in the class want pepperoni. So the 3 representatives vote for pepperoni pizza. So that's 3 votes for pepperoni pizza. Well, in the other classroom, there's only 2 people in there, and they only get 1 vote. Now, they can't control which classroom they're in, but because they are in a smaller classroom, their voice is not as equally represented. Even though they are in another classroom, they have fewer people, but those 2 people might want pizza, but their voice will never be heard because the classroom with 20 people will always cancel them out, no matter what. Now, in the New Jersey plan, the smaller states are like, oh, we have a perfect idea. Everybody will be equal. We'll all have one vote. But if it's the same situation and the room with 20 people only gets one vote and they vote for pepperoni, and then the room with 2 people in it gets one vote and they vote for cheese, we have now canceled each other out. So 2 people canceled out 20 people. So no system is really perfect, and that's why there's a lot of arguing back and forth. You got, a whole bunch of old dudes sitting around in a room. It's all hot and nasty and gross in there, and they're yelling at each other, about who is right and who's wrong. So eventually, we take these and we combine them into what is known as the Great Compromise. So the Great Compromise, notice it's purple now. See, because red, Virginia plan, blue, New Jersey plan, like red and blue, purple, yeah, all right. So in the legislative branch, there's going to be 2 houses. So we take that idea from the Virginia plan up here, right? Yes, okay. In one, it is going to be based on population. We take that idea from the Virginia plan. In the other, it is going to be equal. We take that from the New Jersey plan. So we get rid of the idea of having 2 houses based on population, and we get rid of the idea of only having 1 house in the legislative branch. So now, both the small states and the large states are happy about representation. The Great Compromise is passed. It becomes the Constitution. And the only thing stopping the Constitution from going out to the states to be talked about and hopefully ratified is the issue of slavery. And the Constitutional Convention compromises over the issue of the slave trade and of slavery and how much representation the slave population should count for in the Three-Fifths Compromise. The northern states say, hey, we should just get rid of slavery. The southern states are saying, no way, we'll never do that. So there has to be some sort of middle ground. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, that's talked about on page 247. Great Compromise is on 246. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. But the Three-Fifths Compromise, it says that every 5 slaves will equal 3 free white people, because basically the problem is the northern states don't want the southern states just to be able to count their massive slave populations in their overall population, because remember, 1 house is based on population. So if they do that, the southern states will have a lot more votes. And the northern states are saying, well, there's no way you should be able to do that because you don't even give these people voting rights or freedom or anything. So why would you count them in your overall population if you're not even going to treat them like humans? So they compromise. They say 5 slaves equals 3 free white people. Also, the slave trade cannot be banned until 1808, and that's basically the Three-Fifths Compromise. I'd look over that. There's going to be some questions over that on your test. So, Three-Fifths Compromise, important. They can't ban the slave trade until 1808, or 20 years later, and basically sweeping the problem under the rug. So, and say we'll deal with it in 20 years. So now we look at what actually is in the Constitution, because now it is on its way out to the states, and now people are actually sitting down with it, and it has to be ratified by the states. So we look at 7 principles of the Constitution, which basically means the 7 things that the Constitution is based on. Now, a lot of these we have talked about throughout the year. And basically, if you go to your book and you look at page 262 through 264, you are going to see 7 little paragraphs that outline each one of these terms. And if you read those 7 paragraphs, you will know everything that you need to know about these. So popular sovereignty, page 262. Popular in this case means the people, like this picture of people. Look at them. They all look so happy. In sovereignty, you have a word called reign, which means to rule. So sovereignty means the right to rule. So if we put them together, the people, so remember these nice people over here, have the right to rule, like a king. Like that's why the crown's there. So people have the right to rule. That's popular sovereignty. In our government, we show that we have the right to rule because we vote. Now, we do not vote for everything. We do not vote for every little law and every little tax, because instead we are a republic, which is the second principle of the Constitution, which is on page 263. We rule by voting, but because we are a republic, we vote for representatives, because a republic is a government in which people vote for representatives to govern them, which is something that we have talked about a lot. So hopefully you can remember that. So we build on top of that, and then we want to make sure that those people that we vote for, those representatives that are in the government, do not gain too much power and start acting like kings or queens or nobility. So we put in this idea of limited government, which is on page 265. Limited government is also known as rule of law, which means that no matter what, no matter who you are, you have to follow the rules. So if I go outside on my front lawn, some guy's just walking by, walking his dog on the sidewalk, and for some reason, I don't know why, I just shoot him in the face. I'm going to jail, because that is murder. I just straight up murdered a dude on the sidewalk, going to jail. If the President of the United States walks out on his front lawn of the White House, and the guy's just walking by on the sidewalk, minding his own business, walking his dog, and the President shoots that guy in the face, he's also going to jail, because that is also murder, and it's also against the law. No matter how powerful you are, the law still applies to you. So we limit the power of the government by not giving them special privileges. Federalism is the next one. Federalism is a very important principle of the Constitution. It's on page 263. If you're in my class, we talked about how, imagine that there's a big circle that represents all the power that can be had by all government levels. So you have this big circle of power, and then what you do with it is you take it and then you chunk it up into two smaller circles that overlap, that kind of look like a Venn diagram, right? And in the middle you have things that they share, and on the sides they have things that they each have separate to them. And that's what this little thing down here is. So stop, don't worry about this. Now we're focused on this chart down here. So on one side you have the national government powers, on the other side you have the state powers, and in the middle things that they both can do. So the idea of federalism is the idea of sharing powers. The national government takes care of things that affect the whole nation, like declaring war. That's a big deal. All right, that is a national power. On the other end, you have state powers, things that only affect people maybe in the state. That's like setting up a local school. Like, if we set up a new school in Washington, people are not affected by that in Oregon, so it should be a state power. But if Missouri declared war on Russia, that would affect everybody in the nation. So if Missouri just decided, hey, we're declaring war on Russia, and we don't care what you people think, it'd be a big mess, because Russia's going to come over and drop bombs on everybody, and the only people that want to do that are the crazy people that are living in Missouri. So we don't want to have each state being able to have that power just to declare war. That's a national thing and should be decided on a national level. So we take all that big circle of power and then we split it up into state and national, and then things that they both can do, like collect taxes. They both can collect taxes, which is an important thing. They both can establish courts, punish criminals, and stuff like that. So then from there, what we do is we have the separation of powers, which is the next principle, and that is on page 264. And this is where we get the three branches. And basically what we do is on a national level, we take this circle and then we divide it into three. So you have the executive, you have the judicial, and you have the legislative branch. So now we're taking that and taking the power. We went from the power, big circle of power, to the two smaller circles, and then we split that circle of the national government up into three sections to get the three branches. So when we look at what we're trying to do here is make sure that no one branch has all the powers. So the legislative branch, you're going to look at this, and you're going to need to look at Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution to understand which branch is which and what each of them can do. But legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch enforces, and the judicial branch interprets. So the legislative branch is Congress, executive branch is the president, judicial branch, the head of that is the Supreme Court. Each of them have separate powers. Each of them have different things that they can and can't do, and you need to look at those in all of the 3 articles of the Constitution. But a very important page when you're looking at each of the branches, which brings in the next principle of the Constitution, is checks and balances, which is on page 264. But then this chart right here is on 281, which is important to understand all the branches and understand checks and balances. So if you look at this chart, you can see how does the executive branch check on the court. You follow the blue arrow. That's what they do down here, and then you can see how they check on the president. This chart is very beneficial because it not only will explain checks and balances to you, it will also show you which part of the government is a part of each branch. So it's a good thing to look at. Page 264, checks and balances. We make sure that the president doesn't get too powerful, because if he does stuff wrong, the Congress can impeach him. If the president thinks that the legislative branch is passing too many crazy laws, he can veto those laws, and so forth and so on. If they do pass a law and the judicial branch thinks that it's wrong and it hurts the American people, they declare it unconstitutional. So that's basically the Constitution. We are able to improve and change the Constitution over the years by the amendment process and adding new amendments, like, in 1787, they were not ready to outlaw slavery, but 100 years later they were, so they added the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery. And because of that, because the world changes, and because the document itself can change with it, it is a living document. So that's what the amendment process is all about. Article 5 in the Constitution is where you can find that, and so that's the Constitution. It is now out to the states to be ratified, and pretty soon arguments start popping up about, is the Constitution right or is the Constitution wrong? So we have 2 groups, Federalists, Anti-Federalists. Federalists are people who are Federalists can be found on page 249, 250, and then Anti-Federalists are 250 as well. So the Federalists are for the Constitution. Federalists for. Anti-Federalists are against the Constitution. Against, anti. So you need to remember that, obviously. But then you also kind of need to think about why or how the Federalists prove their points, or why the Anti-Federalists don't want the Constitution. Federalists say that it's based on federalism, that's where the name comes from, and that it's shared powers and everything will be fine. And they put those ideas into the Federalist Papers, which you can read about on page 250. So the Federalist Papers are a series of essays that go out, and they are just written because they want to make sure everybody understands that the Constitution is a good thing, and that's what we should do. So on the other side, the Anti-Federalists felt that there needed to be a Bill of Rights, which you can find on page, talks a little bit about on page 255, and then also the actual Bill of Rights is in your book, and it starts on page 286. But also the Anti-Federalists thought that the states are having too much power taken away from them. So they want more power brought back to the states, but that's kind of the problem with the Articles of Confederation. That's why we got rid of it in the first place. So, it goes through all this voting, all this ratification, and it eventually gets ratified, and mainly it's because they throw on the Bill of Rights at the end, which is the first 10 amendments, and that brings us to the last principle of the Constitution, which is individual rights. 286, 265 as well as that little definition for you, and then 286 is just where the Bill of Rights starts. So you have to understand that with all of these rights freedom of speech, freedom of press, 5 basic freedoms, 1st, 5th, 9th, 10th Amendments, all those. No matter where you go in the country, as you move around, if you read Article 4, if you did your B level, the last question, Article 4, no matter where you go, your rights stay the same. No matter where you go in the country, your rights don't change from Missouri to Illinois. So that's kind of the story of how the country was formed and how we set up our government, and Units 4 and 5. There you go. That's what's on your QA. Study tonight. Study over your notes. You'll do great. Have fun. Good luck.